And what people don't appreciate is that when you grow up in an environment like mine, in many ways, it's like being in a war zone all the time. It's completely unpredictable, chaos. You never know what's going to happen. And as a result, your sympathetic nervous system, our flight, fight, or fear response is chronically engaged. We're tense. We're looking around all the time. We can't focus. We need to be aware of anything that might happen. And this impedes your ability to attend or be present.
Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Join the movement of deeply curious learners by hitting that subscribe button. Boom, right now. The Dov Baron Show is not just another podcast. It is your passport to unparalleled insights. The opening line to the introduction of his new book is, "The universe doesn't give a fuck about you." Welcome, you're about to embark on a journey where science meets the mystical. Today on the Dov Baron Show, we're diving deep into the realms where few dare to tread. That is with neuroscientist and a neurosurgeon, Dr. James Doty. Whether you loved or loathed The Secret, today's episode will challenge your beliefs and expand your understanding of the universe. We're about to unravel the neuroscience behind manifestation with Dr. James Doty. He is a distinguished neuroscientist and neurosurgeon at Stanford University. With each episode of the Dov Baron Show, we try to feature the world's greatest leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists, from astronauts who traveled the vastness of space to presidential candidates trying to make sense of the world on the brink. We dive deep into the most intriguing minds. On the next two episodes are certainly no exception. Our special guest stories and insights will captivate and inspire you. Hit the subscribe button and become part of our global community today. Stay tuned as we explore mind magic. Since 1997, Dr. James Doty has excelled not only in the operating room, but also in the most intriguing research labs where he has explored the intersections of compassion and the human brain. Author of the New York Times bestseller, which is called Into the Magic Shop, he is also the host of the accompanying podcast with the same name. Dr. Doty brings us the insights from his latest groundbreaking work, Magic Mind, the Neuroscience of Manifestation and how it changes everything. Prepare to be captivated as he decodes the science that underpins manifestation and reveals why the universe might not give a fuck, but maybe you should. Don't miss this enlightening conversation. Turn up the volume, open your mind, and discover how neuroscience can explain the seemingly inexplicable. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together, turn up the volume, and help me welcome returning champion, Dr. James Doty. Welcome, James.
Hello. Wow, what an introduction. I'm going to have to impress myself with that introduction. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
I so enjoyed our last conversation. You're an officer and a gentleman, and I really appreciate it. I love the way you come at things from a very different point of view. As I said, you're a scientist, a neuroscientist, a surgeon. You also have worked with the Dalai Lama and many spiritual beings who were really sort of in that realm, and you bridge this gap so beautifully. And where I want to start is where I always start, which is in context. My work is around the emotional source code. In our last show, we talked about where you came from. Of course, not everybody heard the last time you were on. Give people a little bit of context about where you came from, because it's a very different place than where you are today.
Sure. I have a background that many people would not suspect from, if you will, where I am today. And that's because so few people actually overcome hardships to excel. My background was one where my father was an alcoholic and my mother had had a stroke when I was a child, was partially paralyzed, unfortunately chronically depressed, attempted suicide. We were on public assistance. We had been evicted from various residences, and this is not an environment typically where children reach the pinnacles of what society calls success, which is typically wealth, position, power. I, at the age of 12, actually felt hopeless, felt a sense of despair, and really created a narrative that I was not going to have a good future. And it's particularly difficult if you have a degree of intelligence, because if you don't, you just accept the situation. If you do, you're sitting there going, why is this happening to me? I don't understand. I'm just as smart as everyone else. What changed things for me, actually, and thus the title of the first book, Into the Magic Shop, was that when things would get difficult at home, oftentimes I would get on my Stingray bicycle and ride as far and as fast away as I could. And at one time, I ended up at a strip mall where there was a magic shop. And I walked in there, and the owner was not there, but his mother was there. It turned out she knew absolutely nothing about magic. I'd had a deep interest in magic, but we began talking. I have to tell you, and I'm sure you've met people like this, their very presence is one of like positive energy. They radiate goodness. They're kind. You feel they're not judging you, and they're listening to you. And this was how this woman presented herself. Her name was Ruth. And we began a conversation. And after about 15 or 20 minutes, she said to me, I really like you. I'm going to be here for another 6 weeks. If you show up every day, I think I can teach you something that could really help you. And I have to admit to you, I did not show up because I had any degree of self-awareness. I showed up because, one, I had absolutely nothing else to do. And two, she was giving me chocolate chip cookies. So I did show up, and she taught me two things. This was before this concept of mind training or meditation or neuroplasticity was even a part of the lexicon in popular culture. Regardless, she taught me what would now be considered a mindfulness practice or a way to calm your mind. And what people don't appreciate is that when you grow up in an environment like mine, in many ways, it's like being in a war zone all the time. It's completely unpredictable, chaos. You never know what's going to happen. And as a result, your sympathetic nervous system, our flight, fight, or fear response is chronically engaged. We're tense. We're looking around all the time. We can't focus. We need to be aware of anything that might happen. And this impedes your ability to attend or be present. And so she taught me a relaxation technique, a focus technique. And then two other components that are really important is she taught me a self-compassion technique. And very much this relates to what we're going to talk about in regard to manifestation. Because so many of us, we sit there and tell ourselves, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. It's not possible. I cannot. And the brain doesn't know the difference between truth or untruth. So once you make a statement, it is not possible, that becomes your truth. And by definition, it is not possible. And so she taught me how to not only decrease the loudness of that voice, but to change it through positive self-affirmation. But the important thing that happened was that when I changed how I treated myself, which was very hypercritical, it made me see that everyone is suffering and that everyone deserves compassion. And ultimately, it changed how I interacted with the world. It changed how I responded to my parents. I used to have a lot of anger and hostility. It wasn't so much they didn't love me, it's just they weren't there for me. But when I understood that they did not have the tools to help themselves, my anger dissipated. And also, when I no longer carried that anger and hostility, it changed how people reacted to me in the world. And that actually allowed me to have a change in my beliefs. I thought anything was possible. And ultimately, Ruth, this woman, taught me a visualization or manifestation technique. And that really changed the fundamental trajectory of my life.
And that is Into the Magic Shop. And again, if you haven't read that book, I highly suggest you do it. It's very inspiring. And at the same time, I remember the commonality as we spoke last time about our backgrounds and actually the bike. I had a bike that I made. I'm about as mechanical as a wet blanket. I mean, I'm so not mechanical, but as a kid, there's that desperation. And I made a bike out of bits and bobs that I could find and put a bike together and then went off on my bike and to get away. And I remember pedaling so hard. I'd pedal until it felt like my muscles would break out of my skin in my legs because it was just a great way to focus and get away. You had this wonderful lady in your life who brought that to you. I want to bring up something here that I think is very important. Well, let's just talk about the concept of manifestation because it isn't new, as you and I were talking about earlier. I think I read about it initially in Mary Baker Eddy's work and Quimby's work. And then when I studied the Vedas and the Upanishads, it was so many references to what I would now call manifestation. They talked about how we brought things into life. But all these talks about the relationship between our deepest intentions and our physical reality. But then again, Christian Science, which was, Mary Baker Eddy, New Thought, Quimby, Indian spirituality with the Vedas and the Upanishads, and then neuroscience. This seems like quite the bridge to jump across from the tragically woo-woo to the very, very, very scientific. Explain that bridge for us. How did you get across that bridge?
Well, first of all, I remain curious. I remain open. I try to be non-judgmental, but I try to base my conclusions or deductions on reality and not on woo-woo. Let me give you an example, and I'm trying to think of her name, which I can't, but the woman who founded the Charter for Compassion, she won the TED Prize in '08. And the reason I bring that up is she got 19 spiritual and religious leaders, she's a former nun herself, to discuss the origin or basis of every religion. And ultimately, it was based on compassion and the Golden Rule. But as you know, in ancient times, we did not have neuroscience, so we tried to explain things by phenomenon that made sense within our culture or our geography. And as a result, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Sikh tradition or any of the other traditions, these ideas are all based fundamentally on compassion and the Golden Rule, but they've created a dogma around them. You simply need to look at the fact that there, as an example, 35,000 different sects of Christianity, if not more. Well, who's right? It's ridiculous to even get into that discussion because, frankly, none of them are right. Each of them did two things. One, it explained an unknown phenomenon. Two, it played to the ego of the person promoting that narrative, and oftentimes for power, position, wealth, etc. And in many ways, this idea of manifestation and the woo-woo or the pseudoscience around it, and you mentioned Quimby and the New Thought movement and some of these others, the Vedanta and the Upanishads, all of these have narratives that are based on the unknown and providing an explanation. But let's look at the science and talk about that a little bit. First off, in Western capitalist society, if you will, there is a narrative that has been promoted that success, which means money, power, position, things, equates with happiness. And unfortunately, a lot of people have bought into that. So people who have wealth, position, and power, they use comparison, if you will, or they want to show it off so people will be jealous, and it actually will make them feel better, although that's quite shallow and transitory. And then the people on the other side, they want this because they believe that same narrative. And the fact of the matter is there are a couple problems with that. One is that external affirmation will never make you feel whole. It will never make you happy. The only thing that does that is it has to come from within oneself. And to do that, you have to accept yourself as you are. Your authentic self, not the projection you want people to see. And unfortunately, in modern society, because we didn't grow up, let's say, in the village where we died and where we lived in intergenerational families and everyone loved us and supported us in that community, we didn't have this constant narrative going on, I'm not good enough, because everybody supported us and we were good enough. In modern society, everyone is afraid of being judged because you're not near family. You're in environments that are highly competitive. You have to work for a living. You have to make money. You have to provide food, shelter. And this causes a lot of stress and anxiety. So people like to promote things that they have or accomplishments with this idea that, oh, well, then people are going to like me and that'll make me feel better. It never does. And on some level, it actually stimulates your sympathetic nervous system because this is a fear narrative. I need to be accepted. I have to do this. And this actually impedes what we call cognitive brain networks in terms of their best functioning. Now, this is not to say that you cannot, quote unquote, manifest things through this, but one, it will not make you happy generally. And two, it will actually oftentimes make you more unhappy. So how do you shift to the other side? You have to realize that we evolved as a species to care. And what I mean by that is, unlike other species that when they're born, the offspring run off into the jungle or the forest, our offspring have to be cared for 10, 15 years. I have an older daughter, maybe over 30 years, but we have to care for them. And if we don't care for them, they don't survive. So we have what I would say is a genetic imperative to care. But why would we do that with such time and resources required to do so? Because we're rewarded when we care. We have the release of different neurotransmitters, such as oxytocin, which is the bonding or love or affiliative hormone. When we care, we're rewarded by our pleasure centers being stimulated. Plus, it shifts us into engagement of our parasympathetic nervous system, where we're actually meant to live almost all the time. And this is when our cognitive brain networks function at their best. It's when our peripheral physiology functions at its best. You see, the sympathetic nervous system was designed millions and millions of years ago to protect us in a harsh environment. But it was meant to engage. Let's say the grass moved on the savanna in Africa. You knew there was a predator there. Your sympathetic nervous system would engage. You would get up and you would run. You would survive or not. But if you survived, you immediately shift back down into engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system. Unfortunately, in modern society, for most people, on some level, it's chronically engaged, and this is to our detriment. And this is why so many people, when we talk about manifesting, are focused on themselves. I want X, I want Y. This has also been aggravated by, unfortunately, a narrative in our educational system over the last 20 or 30 years, which is changing now, which is this concept that every kid deserves an award. If you enter a contest, everybody gets a medal. And of course, real life doesn't work that way.
You won't tell me you did not get trophies for every time you just showed up.
Isn't that the way it works? Exactly. And this is the problem, is we've created also an entitled group of people who somehow think, I don't have to work hard. I should just get because I'm here. And it doesn't work that way. Life does not work that way. You have to work, and they're winners and they're losers, whether you or I like it or not. And so creating a group of people who have that entitlement narrative in the face of our Western society has created a people who are very self-focused about what they think they want. So that's part of the problem. It's coming from a fear narrative of insecurity versus the correct narrative, which is, how can I be of service? Because we evolved to care, whether it was in the nuclear family or in regard to, quote unquote, the tribe we're in. Because remember, until 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, we lived typically in groups of 100 to 150 people, and it was a harsh environment, so everyone had to work together to make sure everyone was okay. So everyone cared about the other. And of course, modern society has changed that dramatically. So what I would suggest is, if you want to maximize your potential to manifest in the right way, if you will, is to be in the right mindset, be focused on being of service to others, understanding that it will do two things. It will change or make you understand the difference between what you think you want and what you need, and it will dramatically increase the likelihood of what you are trying to manifest.
So I want to go into all those things in a moment, but from a neuroscientific point of view, as in the process, there is a lot of woo around manifestation, and there is some hard science around it that people can sort of dig into. You and I talked about earlier that in 2007, I wrote a book called What the Bleep Does It Mean, which was about the quantum science of manifestation. I wrote The Equation for Manifestation, which was quantum physics, metaphysics, psychology, and brainwave patterning in the law of resonance, not the law of attraction. And people talked a lot about those kinds of things, trying to understand them. But from a neuroscientific point of view, couldn't manifestation simply be part of the reticular activated system? It's just a confirmation bias that I've focused on this, and now my brain, using the RAS, is filtering and processing that information in accordance with my bias, and therefore I have a tendency to seek out and interpret and remember information that fits my pre-existing hypotheses, belief, or imagery.
Yes.
Thanks for that in-depth answer. So that is what's happening. Right? So that's what we're doing. We're looking for evidence of. So if we're looking for evidence of, and we're using the strategies that you put forward in the book, let's talk about what I found to be the elephant in the room constantly, which was the power of conscious intention. And that is like, ooh, that's a fuzzy one. From your research, what distinguishes conscious intention from unconscious manifestation? How can we become more aware of that? What is the distinction in that between intent and attachment? That's where I feel like so many people get lost. Does that make sense?
I think so. Basically, clearly the reticular activating system is associated with consciousness, the awake state, et cetera, and it intersects with these various cognitive brain networks, one of which, and you talk about conscious or unconscious intention, one of which is what we call our default mode network. And this is self-referential. That happens when our mind wanders or we daydream. But this is where we create the narrative of who we are or what we wish. And then this intersects with what we call the task positive network. And that includes 3 other cognitive brain networks. And a cognitive brain network is not necessarily a discrete area in the brain. It is an area of the brain that is comprised of different parts, but they all work together for a particular task. So the task positive network is associated with, if you will, focusing your attention in a manner such that it ultimately reaches consciousness, and then the conscious fulfills the desires of the unconscious, if you will. So that's composed of a couple parts. And one of the things I talk about is the reality that our sensory organs have about 10 million bits of information coming in every second, but on a conscious level, we can only process 52 or 100. But when we consciously try to embed our intention into our subconscious, there are several techniques that actually energize that. And these are associated with what is commonly talked about in terms of manifestation. And that is utilizing our sensory organs, all of them or most of them, to embed that intention. There is a saying that what fires together wires together, meaning that if you're engaging all of your senses, you do it in a repetitive fashion. This is laying down the neural pathways and strengthens them, and that increases the likelihood of you manifesting your intention. So, as an example, you would think about your goal, you write it down, you read it silently, you read it aloud, you visualize it, you see yourself in that position, and doing this repetitively creates these neural pathways or new neural pathways or strengthens them. That's how you embed it into your subconscious. Once it has been processed by the default mode network, then it activates our task positive network, which is what we call our salience network. Now, I use the example of, if you will, as you embed it in your subconscious, it's as if you're putting a file into a filing cabinet. And then once it's there, your salience network sees it's been placed there and acts as a bloodhound, if you will, to realize, 1, it's important, something you want to do. 2, it then activates your attention network to focus your attention to have it manifest. And then once that has been activated, your subconscious is constantly looking around for situations or opportunities that will increase the likelihood of you manifesting. As an example, I'm sure you've been to a party and it's very, very noisy. Well, above all of that noise, if someone says your name, you turn to it. And it's not that your name was particularly louder than any other person or conversation going on. It's because that is your identity and you're so attuned to that all the time. And this is the power of embedding your intention. You've embedded your identity, you can embed your attention to manifest your intention. And so, as an example, there's a project that I've been working on for a number of months. And again, it's one I want to accomplish. And I was at a coffee shop. Well, it's an unusual topic, but there's a very loud conversation going on. Yet above the din of that noise, I heard 2 people talking about the same topic I had an interest in. And it's not one that would normally be talked about in general. I went over and introduced myself. It turns out these are individuals who have a similar interest. We started chatting, and now we're working on the project together. So it tells you how this happens. You have created the situation for synchronicity, or what we would call coincidences, to occur because your subconscious is always on the alert for these possibilities to happen.
We're coming close to the end of part 1 of the show, and I want to get into more of the details in part 2. I want to come back to the question that I finished with earlier, which was, there's a really important piece that I think that most people don't fully grasp, and that's intention versus attachment. A lot of people have an intention, they become very attached, and it kind of pushes things away. Help people understand that, because I feel like, well, if I've got to put my intention in it, I'm supposed to be attached, but I'm not supposed to be attached.
Well, and that's an excellent point, because as you know from your understanding of a variety of religious practices, and particularly Buddhism, attachment and craving are the greatest cause of suffering. And this is because what happens to many people. In some ways, they become obsessed with the outcome of a situation. And of course, regardless of what that situation is, for most people, many times you don't get what you wished for. And if you're so attached to it, one, it can destroy you. But then the other thing that happens is that there's some people who are so attached to accomplishing something, they accomplish it, they stand at the top of the mountain, they're standing there waiting for all this external affirmation, which will never fill you or make you whole or fill that emptiness you have inside of you. But the other thing that happens is you look behind them and there's a trail of carnage, of things that they've ignored, family members, children, others, all to accomplish a goal, which frankly oftentimes is ego-driven and means nothing. And so the most important aspect is balance and understanding what's really important, because being attached to a goal can actually make you not present because you're constantly focused on a future that hasn't occurred while you're ignoring the present moment, and that's where everything happens. And our survival as a species relates to being in the present moment, connecting with other human beings. That's when our physiology works at its best, is when we're in dialogue, connecting, helping, being of service to other people.
I want to get into more of this when we come back. I want to really take a look at the switch and how that switch takes place. So you've talked about people who pursue things and then they get them and then it doesn't satisfy them. I want to talk about that because that is a form of manifestation that maybe not wanting to look at. I want to talk about mental imagery and using the senses. I also want to talk about the challenges that we face in manifestation if we're in the stressed state. And I also want to talk about your new venture, Happy AI. So there's a lot that we can get into in part 2 of the show. I hope you'll stay with us to the end, dear listener. Remember, we're going to be back for part 2 of the show in just one click. Before we go off, though, I want to make sure that you know where you can find out more about James, about his books and about his podcast and all of his resources. So, James, please tell our listener where they can find out more about you.
Yes. One is you can go to my website, jamesrdoty, DOTYMD.com, and that has my books, the podcast, and a whole variety of other resources. You can check out the work I do at Stanford at the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. That's CCARE, CCARE.stanford.edu. And you can also check out this mental health app that I've been working on for the last couple of years. And you can find that at Happy, HAPPI.ai. So Happy has been converted to have AI in it. Happy, HAPPI.ai. And as you can imagine, not only does it contain, if you will, a conversational AI knowledge base of psychology and compassion-focused therapy, but also it utilizes a human avatar to interact with you. And there are several good reasons why that's the case.
Beautiful. Thank you, James. And for you, dear listener, remember, we're going to be back in just one click. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. See you in part 2 in just a moment.